Hello and welcome to this video. This video is called part 2 of my history of progressive rock in 60 albums. Right? It's not going to be 60 albums, it's actually going to be more than 60 albums. But what I'm going to try and do is, over a series of video, do a step-by-step, slow description of how progressive rock emerges, how it reached its sort of heyday in the 1970s, then what happened after that, and we're going to go right up to now, year by year, you know, sort of picking an album from each year and discussing that album just to try and get an overall picture of how progressive rock develops. On these videos, I really want to challenge the established idea of the history of progressive rock, which was, there was some good stuff there, but it was a little bit overblown and pretentious. You have to pick yourself through all this sort of pretentious stuff to find the jewels. And then obviously punk came out and taught all the prog musicians they were doing it all wrong, and their music was rescued, and it all went back to being great, you know, with Joy Division and The Cure and the Smiths and all that. But you know, that sort of usual line about the history of popular music. Well, I'm going to challenge that. And now, as we go forward, there's a big problem with talking about progressive rock because there's many gatekeepers of this genre. You know, I have done a video called What Makes Progressive Rock Crap, and I talk about that a lot on there, right? I don't want to get onto it here. So on part 1 of this, I defined what prog was. I came up with a system, because you anal retentive prog fans, you love a good system, don't you? So we now have a system, if you go back there, where we can measure how prog these artists actually are, because I know I'm going to be pushing the boundaries through this history of what prog actually is to try and show the huge influence that this genre had on rock and roll. I'm going to really try and create the argument that the intellectual and musical high point of rock and roll as a popular music form reached its peak with progressive rock, and what was innovated by those bands has then been used by every single artist across the whole of popular music every time they wanted to extend what they were doing, right? And that's the great gift of progressive rock to the world. So come on, prog fans, let's champion this absolutely incredible genre. Okay, so obviously progressive rock is rock that has progressed. Like, let's just start there. What do we mean by progressed? Rock and roll, this visceral genre of music that is the sort of child of the blues, it's the child of country music, it's the child of rhythm and blues, which is actually jazz and blues mixed together. These American black art forms, right, which are bubbling away, and then you stick some country music in there, which just sort of tightens some of the songwriting up, and then you put that into the world as teenagers are emerging in the Western world because of the affluence that suddenly they have access to because of the Second World War. So the Western countries after the Second World War, especially America, not so much the UK actually. UK is a different history. People were still quite poor in the 50s, but in America suddenly you've got there's affluence there. Now, my parents who grew up in the 1950s told me that back then you pretty much, you know, you could pack your job on a Friday and walk into a new job on a Monday. There was lots of employment. The reason for this is because there was a lot of rebuilding, there was a lot of growth, there were a lot of jobs where there'd been a whole workforce because of the Second World War, as it's expanded, and some people hadn't come back for the war, and all sorts of things that I would love to get into in detail. But the point is, the teenager emerged with rock and roll. Rock and roll is actually quite a simple, visceral form, which sticks it to the man, is a rebellious form. The teenagers want a different, you know, life. They don't want to, you know, follow in the same footsteps as their parents. And so rock and roll turns into rock music, and that searching for a new way of doing stuff, a new world order, as you could think of it, actually is where young people start to embrace the viewpoints of all sorts of different people. You know, they embrace the viewpoints of black people, of gay people, of women, you know, of all sorts of different groups, you know, the poor, the underprivileged. And we get the emergence in the 60s of the civil rights movement. Now, the civil rights movement is very important because it's actually opening our arms to different viewpoints. It's taking rock and roll and it's almost like saying, what else can we throw into here? A rock starts to emerge. The great and the most important figure in this is Bob Dylan, who in the early 60s, through opening up rock and roll to American folk forms, and especially Woody Guthrie, which is a political use of folk, he democratizes rock and roll. And the reason I say he democratizes it because he sings in a different accent. You don't have to be able to sing to stand up and make a great art, right? But he also brings in electrical instruments in. He takes rock and roll forms, he fuses it with the blues, with folk forms, and suddenly this is influencing all musicians, and it's influencing musicians to think we can now expand the boundaries of what we class as rock and roll. Now, in the early 60s, there is a huge rock and roll fan, huge doo-wop fan called Frank Zappa, and Frank Zappa is sat there with an interest in the blues, an interest in doo-wop, but also an interest in modern classical music and experimental jazz, Eric Dolphy and people like this. Him hearing Bob Dylan makes him realise that you could use rock and roll as a form and you can expand on it. He films a band called the Mothers of Invention, and they bring their first album out in March 1966 called Freak Out, and that is where I'm going to start on my list. Now, because there's so many important albums in the 1960s, I'm not going to do 10 albums because there's not enough years. There's no prog albums in 1960. I'm going to start with Freak Out in 66, and I'm going to cram 10 albums into that period. And we're going to, on this video, really look at 1966 and 1970 when the groundwork's really being laid for prog. Right, I would say that Freak Out is the first progressive rock album. It's doing so much, and the thing that makes it important is there's nothing like it in rock and roll or pop music at that time. The Beatles are pushing the form, you know, they're doing Rubber Soul and Revolver, but they're still pretty much pop songs. There's some interesting stuff going on in those pop songs, and they're expanding like this. But, you know, Freak Out contains huge monster jams, modern classical epics that span whole albums. You know, it's got like the integration of millions of different genres. It's absolutely, it's in conceptual continuity. It's just the first progressive rock album. Frank Zappa is an American from the United States. So this is really interesting that he's opened the door to this world of experimentation. He's opening the door to two important music forms, I think. One is jazz, and the other one, most importantly, is his love of experimental modern classical music and the integration of those techniques into rock and roll. This is absolutely groundbreaking. We could follow his career through Absolutely Free to We're Only in the Money, and then Lumpy Gravy and Uncle Meat. If we look at Uncle Meat, you know, just a couple of years later, 67, 68, this is, again, he's still light years ahead of anybody else at that time. Zappa is simply not light years ahead of any rock musician on the planet in 1966, right? We can really see, I think, the effect of that album, right? So there's two artists that I think are seminal in the development of the progressive rock tendency. Not progressive rock as a genre, but the tendency, the idea of wanting to expand on the form. One would be Bob Dylan, right? I think it's that, even though he's got nothing to do with prog, I think he opens up the door, and then Frank Zappa walks in. This affects every band on the planet. You can see all the sort of UK beat groups like the Kinks, you know, playing their sort of really British guitar-based rock and roll, and then the progressive elements start to creep in. You can see it with The Who, you can see it with the Small Faces, you can see it with the Yardbirds. Of course, the biggest band on the planet is the Beatles, and we see it with the Beatles. And my second album in my history of progressive rock is, of course, Sgt. Pepper. That has such a cultural impact. And here's an album which is a concept album with ideas that run through multiple genres, pulling all these different things. Is Sgt. Pepper a prog album the same way Close to the Edge is? No, it's not. But in the development of prog, I think just the huge cultural impact of this album on society means that we have to put this into the list. So at number 2, and that comes out in April 67. Now this is quite interesting. I've actually got the months that these albums have all been released by. Freak Out came out in March 1966, which means some of the groundwork for that album... No, sorry, it was recorded in March 1966. I've got the recording dates here. But some of the groundwork goes back to 1965. This is incredible. And then the effect of that, I think... there is a direct effect. I think the Beatles pretty much admitted that they were listening to Frank Zappa at this time. And that emerges with Sgt. Pepper in April 1967. All right? So we're starting to see this shift, this change in rock and roll. These albums are different to what has gone on before. And number 3, right, from May 1967, a month later, Pink Floyd are making Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Now, Piper at the Gates of Dawn can almost be seen as an upgrade to the Beatles. You know, you got the Beatles doing what they do, but everything the Beatles are doing in terms of, you know, the use of studio technology, the psychedelicness and the influence of sort of, you know, hallucinogenic drugs and happenings, the English aesthetic, all these things I've discussed at. It's like Pink Floyd on that first album just come in and amp it up. Pink Floyd's first album is unlike any of the other albums. I actually think Pink Floyd then, I wouldn't say flounder. What they do is they become incredibly experimental after that point, and they're allowed to because progressive rock is, as a cultural entity, is now emerging. You know, the audience want their mind blown. They're looking for their rock bands not to play it safe and give them something commercial. By this, you know, late 60s period, they want them to blow their minds. But actually, the Syd Barrett's influence on that first album, I think, is key to the development of progressive rock. And I think his songwriting genius and the whimsy, you know, which is evident in so many bands like Gentle Giant and Yes, is evidenced back in May 1967 on Piper at the Gates of Dawn. I've talked about, you know, that I'm not the biggest Pink Floyd fan in the world, but when we start to look at the history of progressive rock, they're going to crop up over and over again. And people out there are going to shout, oh, they're not a prog band. And at some point I may have to sit down and use my Progometer, which I described in the previous video, to actually have a look and see actually how prog Pink Floyd is. But I haven't got that prepared now, but we might have to do that at some point in this list, because they're going to crop up over and over again. And sometimes in this case they're going to crop up as being the height, the most innovative thing at that moment in time in the development of progressive rock, and other times it's going to be that they represent the worst for me. So I warn you now. So number 3, Piper at the Gates of Dawn from May 67. Right, in September 67, an album is released in America called Electric Bath by the big band leader Don Ellis. Right, now I'm going to throw this in as a maverick choice. I think this is pretty important in the development of not only jazz fusion, but also in the development of progressive rock. What we have here is a big band album, and with a big band album come musical arrangements, and those arrangements come from obviously the history of big band, you know, Count Basie, you know, Duke Ellington, Fletcher Henderson, but also at this point with the influence of third stream jazz, which is basically jazz's prog. People like Stan Kenton, right, which is where classical influences come in. Don Ellis is pulling on those, so we have these classical forms coming into long compositions which exhibit a high degree of instrumental virtuosity, and most importantly, Don Ellis is just pushing the envelope in terms of obtuse rhythms and odd times. Electric Bath is a masterpiece. There's so many fusion albums here where they're trying, at this time, where they're trying to fuse jazz and rock music, and it's not really working. Electric Bath is a masterpiece. Here we have September 67. I think its influence on jazz fusion is pretty big because of the musicians that were playing for Don Ellis were the working musicians in Hollywood at that time that were doing all the fusion sessions. But I wonder how much it had an influence on the integration of odd times into prog, because talking through here, there's no other place where that would come from, you know, except perhaps Frank Zappa. But Frank Zappa is also sharing musicians with Don Ellis. That's part of the same scene. Anyway, I'm offering it there. It's in the mix. At number 4, Electric Bath by Don Ellis, which came out in September 67. Right? There's 2 bands emerged in the UK mid to late 60s. One is Cream and one is the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Jimi Hendrix comes in a little bit later than Cream. They're both pioneering so many ideas that I think are important in the development of progressive rock. For me, Jimmy has the edge because as time goes on, he starts to use the studio as an experimentation vehicle, you know. On the second album, Electric Ladyland, which he begins recording in 1967 and runs around to 68, so sort of same time period, he's really pushing the envelope out. And I think many here would admit that Electric Ladyland by Hendrix is an out-and-out prog album. I think it's one of the albums, it's a successful album, it's a big selling album. And Hendrix really is a pioneer of prog. He's a big pioneer of jazz fusion. And I think we have to think about how jazz fusion relates to prog. Those two energies are emerging in popular music at that time, right? And they're going to cross over. And there's this grey area that we've explored on this channel so many times of bands in between, you know, prog and fusion. Okay. At number 6, I have The Days of Future Past by the Moody Blues that comes out November 1967. And I think this is a pretty important album in the history of progressive rock. The integration of the orchestra into a rock band setting, the use of sort of the English aesthetic, the adaptation of pop song forms into a wider sort of more intellectual classical way of thinking about popular music. It gets mentioned so often as being one of the precursors to progressive rock. I put it on the list, so that's what I got at number 6. So we could see at this point, 1967, that especially in England, there's a lot of bands that are expanding their form. They're considering how they play this American jazz and blues and Afro-American music form that has become this huge thing in the UK. How do you play that with the consideration of the culture from where you come from? So in other words, how do you integrate English or British cultural values into that music? And of course, I think this is happening in Europe as well. There's a whole bunch of bands in Europe that are going to create sort of the European progressive rock. I know I feel that European progressive rock seems to emerge a little bit later. We're obviously talking about bands like Magma, Faust, Can, and Focus, although Focus seems to be far more influenced by this sort of English progressive rock bands. But across the world, you know, we see the integration of local cultural influences into rock and roll. And that begats a whole bunch of things that we can call progressive rock. Now, I don't know. I'm very inclusive in terms of what I would class as progressive rock. And of course, Can and Faust and Magma are all progressive rock. But it's almost like an entirely different type of progressive rock to what I'm talking about that's going on here. I think in Europe, in 1968 in France, there's a much more left-wing socialist revolutionary agenda going on, which is much more heartfelt. You know, English progressive rock is reserved, it's very English. And that seems to inform, there's a revolutionary aspect to Magma and Can and Faust and all those types of bands, which I think gives it a different sort of aesthetic. There's also, that seems to be linked to me much more with free jazz. And there it seems to be that it's the integration of a European aesthetic with a jazz aesthetic, you know. And we can also see that emerging with ECM records and a whole bunch of sort of European jazz. People like Tahei Ripdahl and Jan Garbarek, which, if we're going to include Can and Faust, we almost need to include those in the whole progressive rock thing. And I would, you know, but the whole point is here we can say, well, how progressive rock are they? But at this point in the 1960s, 67, 68, I can't really pinpoint the key albums in Europe. I think what's going to happen is that the UK being a centre now because of the Beatles in terms of what's going on in rock and roll, in rock music, we're leading the way at that point. And so what happens is by 1970, because there's progressive rock bands emerging, then labels are looking around, France and Germany and Holland and go, what have we got, and then those bands start to emerge. I'm sure they're there. The one band that I haven't put on the list though is 69, is Aphrodite's Child. They seem to be really flying the flag for prog pretty early on, so I've tried my best to include what's going on in Europe on this list. You can see on this list as well, Frank Zappa's in there, Don Ellis I've got in there, but what's going on in the late 60s progressive rock-wise in America? There doesn't seem to be much going on. So I really, hopefully, have made the argument now that the home of groundbreaking progressive rock is Britain, is England. Right? In number 7, hugely influenced by Frank Zappa, we have the English version of The Mothers of Invention, which for me is Soft Machine. I've always found Soft Machine very derivative of Frank Zappa, but I think what's important to them is Frank Zappa is so avant-garde. We now have an English version of Frank Zappa in here in England that's gigging alongside the likes of Pink Floyd and Jimi Hendrix. And they are flying the flag for some really experimental approaches. The first album by Soft Machine, which features Kevin Ayers, that comes out in April 1968 though, has a lot more songs on there. I find that more interesting. Once Soft Machine just move over to being a sort of jazz fusion band, I don't find them as interesting, but that first album's more interesting because it's got those elements of the pop song in there that they're pushing at, and I think Kevin Ayers was key in that. And that's also true at number 8. I've got Thoughts of Emilis Davjak by The Nice, which is the band that Keith Emerson was in before ELP. And The Nice are also another key early progressive rock band. I was going to put Colosseum in, but I think Colosseum again are a fusion. Can you see how fusion is mixed in with this? Here in the UK, we're also pioneering. Oh God, what have I done to me? We're also pioneering fusion as well with bands like Colosseum, with Graham Bond, Brian Auger. And Cream and Hendrix have got elements of fusion in there. So there's a big stew pot at this point. But I think I'd throw in Thoughts of an Emilis Davjak. Going back and revisiting that album for this video, what I can hear is pop songs, and these pop songs are being pushed. This rock music is progressing. They're pushing at the sides of what we can class as the pop song, right? At number 9, we now have the genre-defining album. It's led up to this point, but in 1969, after all these albums have been released, King Crimson come together and they make In the Court of the Kings and Crimson. Robert Fripp described this as Jimi Hendrix played by Bartok. That's pretty much what it is. Extended American blues, influenced by free jazz, but shot through a European classical music aesthetic. There we have it. And now, rather than progressive rock just being this idea that we're experimental, we're pushing the boundaries, we're pulling all these influences in, and we're extending this and we're pushing that, we now have a sound which we can point at and go, there's the genesis of the sound, right? And I use the word Genesis probably unwisely, because 69 sees the release of Genesis' first album, which is basically following in the sort of same area, I suppose, of Thoughts of Emilis Davjak, which is pop songs that have been extended a little bit psychedelic. Genesis, yes, these bands I think are still yet to find their prog voice, and we'll be talking about that on the next video. Right, I got one place left on my list of important prog albums. I'm going to put on this list at number 10, Concerto for Pop Group and Orchestra by Deep Purple. Deep Purple are one of the pioneering experimental progressive rock bands of this period. I think what they do on that album is really, really important. Where Days of Future Past is basically their songs with an orchestra added to it. What John Lord's trying to do on this album is really take on classical music form and integrate it into rock band. I think he's far more successful than people make out, and I think this album has to be on the list of the 10 pioneering albums that create progressive rock, and I've put it on the list. Now, I've changed my mind because of the list I've got in front of me. That's not what I've got at number 10. At number 10 I had Track Mass Replica by Captain Beefheart. And the reason I put that on is because there's a whole other world of progressive rock tendencies that I think are embodied by Track Mass Replica, and they're going to be there threatening our comfortable definition of what prog is, you know, and we're going to see it in bands on this list as we go forward through this. But I thought I'm going to give a shout out to Deep Purple. So we're tied here. So I'm going to put them both on, I think. So I told you it would be more than 60. There's going to be a lot of albums. It's going to be one of my biggest lists ever. So I'm going to go through this again. The 1960s albums that formed the beginnings, which I think is what I'm going to call this video, the beginnings of progressive rock, which would be from March 1966, Freak Out by Frank Zappa. From April 67, Sgt. Pepper by the Beatles. From May 67, Piper at the Gates of Dawn by Pink Floyd. We have coming out in September 67, The Incredible Electric Bath by Don Ellis. Coming out in 1968, we have Electric Ladyland, the big double album, the big statement from Jimi Hendrix, where he really takes that extended, you know, free modal jazz blues thing that he's come in, and he just extends that using the recording studio. Very important. And number 6, I have Days of Future Past by the Moody Blues. It came out in November 67. We've got Soft Machine's first album coming out April 1968. Just a month before that, in March 68, we have Thoughts of an Emilis Davjak by The Nice. And then at number 9, I have The Monster That Is in the Court of the Kings and King by King Crimson. And then tied at 10, I've had to squeeze 2 in. I've got Concerto for Pop Group and Orchestra by Deep Purple, and a quizzical knowing nod to Track Mass Replica, probably the most progressive album ever made within the rock genre, wouldn't you say? Although I think, you know, Lou Reed's Metal Machine Music is also vying for that as well. And these progressive rock albums, it's interesting. It's an interesting discussion. Anyway, I've got to the end of the video. I hope you enjoy this exploration of the beginnings. We've knocked 10 albums up. On the next video, we're going to be starting at 970, and from now on, I am going to be having an album per year and discussing why I've added that album to the list. And I think, you know, it will make this journey right up until now. I'm going to keep going all the way up to 2020. It will then erase that sort of structure that that punk, that sort of big divider of the sort of story of prog. I think I can sort of erase that by doing it this way. Anyway, that's all the future, right? That's all the days of future past. Right, let's finish it there. If you like this video, like it. If you want to see more, subscribe. If you want to see when part 3 comes out, press the notification bell. I hope you're happy. If you want to support me doing this stuff, I've got a Patreon there, and I'm putting a whole ton of stuff to support these series of videos in there. And I've also got documented there, you know, how I came up with the Progometer, which is how I determined how prog something is and whether I can include them on this list. So when all you prog gatekeepers go, Pink Floyd aren't prog, you know, I can prove that they are. Shall we do it now? Come on. And this is the appendix now to this video. I'm going to do it right now. I'm going to try and do it on the fly. Right, so I hope my math stands up. So let's see how proggy Pink Floyd actually are using my Progometer. You know it was coming. Let's have a go. Right. Long composition using non-pop song structure, often influenced by classical form. Yes, that's one. Right. That's Atom Heart Mother. Do I need to go further than that? It's the most credible, you know, use of that. Non-blues influenced vocal sound, often singing own regional accent. Yes, without a doubt they do that. Literary allusions in lyrics with non-love song subject matter. Yes, all over Dark Side of the Moon. You know, that is not a song about love songs. And I think, although I cannot think of any direct songs where they're actually quoting from, say, romantic poetry, I don't know. But I'm going to give him a yes on that one. I wish mine not. This is why sometimes I need to prepare. But So we have now got 3 long compositions, non-blues influenced vocal sound, literary allusions in the lyrics, conceptual continuity across the albums, of course, right? Use of integration of modern technology, especially synthesizers and recording technology. 5. Use of odd-time signatures and obtuse rhythms. I don't think they're famous for that. Of course, Money is in 7. I'm going to give them a no on that, even though they did write one of the most famous odd-time signature tracks ever. Shall we give them a 0.5? There's a 0.5 in there. Fantasy or sci-fi imagery, both in album artwork and in the song subject matter. I don't know whether they're not a band. They're a very down-to-earth band. Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Isn't that a quote? I'm going back now. Piper at the Gates of Dawn is a quote from some sort of literary allusion, isn't it? It is there. So I'm going to give them a 1 there, but I'm going to give them a 0.5 for the sci-fi imagery. Musical complexity and instrumental virtuosity. I think this is one of the reasons why Pink Floyd don't get put in the mix, is because I don't think they're as virtuoso as a Yes or a Genesis. So I'm going to say a no there, just to make those people happy that are going to make that 4. The use of improvisation to extend musical, without doubt, and the integration of the aesthetics. So what I have there is, that's 8, isn't it? Plus my 0.5 for the odd times. So they score a whopping 85% on my Progometer. Pink Floyd are prog, so it's done. Shut up, stop saying it, you're wrong, I've proved you wrong. Don't put it in the comments, I don't want to know. All I'm going to do is, I've got a Progometer, you haven't, so stop it. Or unless you're going to invent your own Progometer. And if you are going to invent your own Progometer, let's see a Progometer, right? Because I bet it's not as good as my Progometer. I invented the Progometer. Stop it. Don't even do it. Don't do it. You're wrong. Pink Floyd are prog. Now I'm getting annoyed now, and I don't like it when I get annoyed. You lot do though, don't you? I'm going to finish up there, or I will be off on a rant, and I don't want any of my rants spoiling my history of progressive rock in 60 albums. This has to be serious. We got to keep on track, Andy. Do not stay on track. Reach over to the stop button right now and stop the video. I'll see you on part 3, where we look at the golden age of progressive rock. See you soon. Bye.